My talk was advertised under the title of Gramsci and the Critique of Political Economy. That is not what I will be speaking about directly here today, but I'm very happy to discuss those themes later on during the discussion as well. What I will speak about is the title. You can see the text here in English if my Australian accent is too difficult to follow. I'll speak about the concept of new orders and particularly the notion of hegemony as a method of political work. So I'm attempting here to relate some central topics in Gramsci's thinking to what I see as some of the fundamental challenges of contemporary politics. So from the time of Gramsci's apprenticeship as a militant journalist in the workers' movement in Turin during and after the First World War, he was committed to a vision of the goal of emancipatory politics as the construction of a new order, ordine nuovo. This was the title of one of his most significant early experiments in revolutionary cultural and political organization. In the wide-ranging discussions that have marked the interdisciplinary and international diffusion of Gramsci's thought since the 1960s and 1970s, it has often been thought that his key contribution to the pursuit of such a goal was the development of a novel theory of the nature of modern political, social, and cultural power, encapsulated, of course, in the famous notion of hegemony, a concept which still sometimes, even today, is incorrectly thought to be a concept that Gramsci himself invented. For many interpreters, the great strength of Gramsci's theorization of hegemony has been that it appears to offer something like a sophisticated meta-theory of political modernity, comparable in its range and depth to the now classical theoretical paradigms elaborated by figures such as Hobbes, Rousseau, or Weber, and perhaps even surpassing them in its capacity to comprehend key features of the types of societies that emerged from the wreckage of the 20th century in both metropolitan centres and their supposedly post-colonial peripheries. As the large-scale historical narratives and sophisticated theories proposed in different ways by figures such as Laclau and Mouffe, Stuart Hall, Ranjit Guha, or Partha Chatterjee, as these theories clearly demonstrate, Gramsci certainly can be read as a theorist, if we want, in this sense, with different interpretations of particular passages and famous notes from the prison notebooks, then forming the basis for the development of sometimes very different overall theories and understandings of what hegemony really means. Understood in the sense that these theorists have in common, namely as a general theory, hegemony as a general theory capable of being applied on different terrains and in different academic disciplines, in different national formations. The notion of hegemony will undoubtedly continue to provide significant currents of contemporary leftist politics and theory with powerful ways of analysing the mechanics of the securing and overturning of political orders. Now, in this presentation today, I want to propose a different reading, and a reading that, as I said, attempts to read Gramsci in the perspective of the contemporary emancipatory political movements around us today, movements that are attempting to respond to the end of what we can call neoliberalism's Belle Epoque, of all the wide-ranging crises of authority traversing many national formations, the rise of various aggressive nationalisms, both in Europe and in South Asia, global wars on an increasing scale and all their dislocations. In short, I'm trying to think of some of Gramsci's fundamental concepts in relation to conditions that are not entirely dissimilar to those encountered by Gramsci and his fellow ordinovisti, his fellow New Orderers, over a century ago. We need, I think, to always remember when we discuss Gramsci that despite appearances, he was neither a philosopher, nor an academic political theorist, nor an historian, nor a cultural studies scholar, and the list could continue on to all the areas where he's been very influential, or at least he was none of those things in any conventional sense. He was instead fundamentally a political organizer and a revolutionary strategist. And all his many other concerns and the many interesting insights in his writings were consistently shaped by these overriding political and strategic concerns. Viewed in this perspective, I'm going to argue that Gramsci's prison notebooks outline a sophisticated perspective which is well placed to dialogue with some of the central concerns of contemporary radical social and political movements, and to offer concrete proposals for their further development. And to do this, we need to consider the notion of hegemony not primarily as a theoretical paradigm, or not primarily as a way of convincing ourselves about everything that is wrong with the world, but instead as a strategic method of political work, or in other words, as a perspective that can help us to solve the many problems that surround us. I propose to thematize this strategic method, as I see it in Gramsci's thinking about hegemony, in terms of four central perspectives that are prominent throughout Gramsci's intellectual and political evolution, from his student days in Turin to his period in the early Third International in Moscow to a fascist prison cell in southern Italy, in Turi. I'll characterize the interaction of these perspectives in an Aristotelian sense as an ideology of emancipatory politics. I apologize for the rather academic-sounding phraseology, but there is a purpose to it, quite apart from showing off various types of philosophical terminology. What interests me the most about an Aristotelian approach to these issues is the particular way it can help us to reset the discussion of questions of causation. ITI for Aristotle are not causes in a modern, perhaps Humean sense, derived from David Hume, where we posit an origin which will subsequently go on to produce certain effects. Aristotle's approach, as the first great anti-Platonist, is much more concerned to discover the causes of things, understood in the sense of those aspects which make something what it is. And very famously, he proposed a whole series of different ways we consider the causes of a thing, but very famously, as later became dominant in the reception of Aristotle in scholasticism, a theory of the four causes: final, material, efficient, and formal causes. In this case, the way I'll try and translate that is to suggest that such an ideology of emancipatory politics can help us to think about the goal, the nature, the method, and the form of self-emancipatory politics today. And these are, to thematize them rapidly, firstly, the goal of constructing a new order. Second, the nature of self-emancipatory politics as the production of historical progress. Thirdly, the method of leadership conceived as fragility and experimentation. And fourthly, the organizational form of what I'm calling a pedagogical laboratory. Taken in their productive dialectical interaction, I think these four perspectives enable us to restore something of the dimensions of political strategy to the center of the notion of hegemony. So to begin firstly with the notion of a new order. For Gramsci and his collaborators in that original publication, really an astounding political newspaper in all senses of the word, they weren't the only people back in the early 20th century looking forward to making things new. This was the generation that was caught up in all the desires of political and artistic revolts, from the European-wide upsurge on the left during and after the First World War, leading to the foundation of the modern communist movement, all the way through to what was, remember, supposedly at its origins a revolutionary movement in Italian fascism on the right that followed in the wake of the defeat of those movements on the left. It was also the period of high artistic modernisms in Europe and indeed globally, as well as a period of the first significant stirrings of mass revolutionary national liberation movements in the colonized world. What is distinctive, I think, about Gramsci's developing conception of such a new order is the way in which it emerges and his understanding of the temporality of the new. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Gramsci doesn't view the new as some sort of an eruption in the present of something that is totally unprecedented, effectively a sort of theory of an historical miracle. Nor does he see the new as a simple negation of the past by the present, which would be a theory of superannuation, in a way, of the passing of generations. These were all dominant theological figures at the time, and they were explored by many of Gramsci's near contemporaries, figures such as Georg Lukács, Walter Benjamin, Carl Schmitt, Ernst Bloch. The new order for Gramsci is instead thought of as an active mode of dis- and relocation that is internal to an existing situation. It's a process in which the new is prefigured in a literal sense in the struggles against the old. This conception of prefiguration is not a theory of the actualization of a latent potential in which a partial, perhaps social element, presently marginal and excluded from the existing political order, goes on to somehow expand or grow bigger and progressively displace its antagonist. The new order of hegemonic politics, that is not a process in which the compromised old is simply replaced by a pristine new. This is because, according to the theory of the integral state that Gramsci develops throughout the prison notebooks, there is no element, either social or political or aesthetic or cultural, that is not already a function of and functional to the existing state order. To imagine the construction of a new world as the becoming universal of a previously mere particularity would thus constitute nothing more than a formalist ruse or a trick by means of which the old order would continue to subsist within the new one. Precisely the condition that Gramsci had diagnosed in his critique of the fatalism that had deformed the prior Italian socialist tradition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and which he later extended in his writings in prison into an analysis of the relation between passive revolution and processes of subalternization. So the new order of hegemonic politics, to state this in direct terms, does not aim to replace the existing state order with a supposedly pure actor or set of actors drawn from civil society. Hegemonic politics instead aims to construct the relations of force and institutional forms capable of representing a radical and viable alternative to the existing state of affairs precisely from within it. As this construction, however, is always forced to occur within the determining coordinates of the existing political order of what is a unitary bourgeois integral state, it is a construction that can only occur as simultaneously a deconstruction of the reigning relations that are dedicated to blocking its emergence. So prefiguration here is just as much a type of refiguration based upon refiguring the existing relations of force. Hegemony, in a strategic sense, is the name of this mode of prefigurative struggle. The goal of a new order occurs within this struggle itself as a new practice of ordering and not at some endpoint of a liberated society lying beyond it. To state in simple terms, the revolution will not arrive tomorrow because already our actions today must be revolutionary. From these insights derives Gramsci's conception of a new order of formerly subaltern social classes and groups as a potentially autonomous new order. The political autonomy of the subaltern social classes is not given from the outset, but must be actively fought for. It must be constructed and made to endure in all of those modes of struggle against the existing order, which are modes of struggle that are never entirely freely chosen, but always, to a greater or a lesser degree, are constrained upon us by the existing order itself. For this reason, Gramsci insists that the construction of a new order can only be thought concretely as the conjunction of what he calls moral and intellectual reform, conceived as a subtraction from the principles governing the existing political order, with a concrete economic program, which he understands in an expansive political economic sense as the conscious self-regulation of society's reproduction. It is precisely this dynamic that is condensed in Gramsci's vibrant metaphor of the modern prince as what he calls a concrete utopia, not a messianic moment deferred to the horizon, but an expansive practice within the present as a politics that simultaneously prefigures and enacts. The notion of the new order as a new practice of ordering, already underway, in Gramsci's time reflected the still undiminished revolutionary enthusiasms that emerged in the midst of the crisis of classical imperialism in the First World War and its aftermath. It could appear as a realistic political strategy because it theorized political relations of force that were already operative, attempting to provide them with theoretical coherence, consistency, and direction. In other words, this notion was a timely or a contemporary conception and intervention. Even when the simulacra of fascist counter-revolution later appeared to drain the modernizing impulse of its progressive force, the active sense of constructing the new as relation and institution remained the utopian dream that nourished repeated attempts to renew self-emancipatory politics throughout the long, dark night of the 20th century. To envisage the goal of emancipatory politics today, however, as the construction of a new order or as a new practice of ordering, can seem like nothing if not entirely unrealistic and untimely, inactual. For well over 30 years, so the story goes, emancipatory politics has laboured in a minoritarian key, focused on immediate resistance to this or that particular injustice at any given moment, civil injustice, ethnic injustice, gendered injustice, economic or ecological injustice, but without any totalizing strategic vision. I think it's surely time, finally, to put this fairy story to bed. The multiplicity of movements over the last 30 years, and particularly those over the last decade, have not been isolated instances of reactive and particularistic protest or rehearsals for some real revolution to come. I'll just move this down. Perhaps easier to follow. In their generational learning processes, complicated inheritances and creative extensions, these movements have represented moments in the emergence of a new critical imaginary of leftist politics, an imaginary that is broader in its concerns and sometimes even more radical in its demands than oppositional cultures that preceded it. The clearest example of this, to my mind, is the centrality assumed in contemporary radical discourses and activity by themes of social reproduction initially highlighted by socialist feminists. And I think this new departure is in stark discontinuity with the patriarchal structures of much older leftist political cultures, at least certainly the leftist political cultures that I inherited as a young militant. Leftist practice today impatiently posits an immediate relation between means and ends, seeing the intersection of demands against injustice as constitutive of their nature as demands. To recognise the ensemble of these movements as experimentations in new practices of ordering in the here and now is thus also to project them beyond the present, in their prefigurative capacity of beginning the construction of our possible futures in the midst of the struggles of the present. So the second element, historical progress. The new order that self-emancipatory politics aims to bring into being is characterised unashamedly by Gramsci in the prison notebooks as an instance of historical progress. It's true that few concepts today have fallen out of fashion quite so decisively as that of progress, however it is defined, and most probably for very good reasons. It is not only the association of notions of progress with generations of reformism, the type of naive faith in an historical destiny that Walter Benjamin condemned so forcefully in the German social democracy of his time, which seems to compromise this notion. Nor is it only the observation, theorised by many recent currents of critical theory, that notions of linear or normative progress have been and remain complicit with histories of colonialism, Eurocentrism, and domination. It is also the fact that a banalised conception of progress, cynically masked or marketed as modernisation, figures among the weapons of the dominant politics of order of our time. Progress and modernisation have been regularly invoked as battle slogans in neoliberalism's drive over the last 30 years to roll back the reforms secured by popular struggles in the post-war period. Just as today, increasingly, notions of progress and modernisation are routinely called upon to justify automation and artificial intelligence's role in capital's restructuring of labour relations, in all so many cliched repetitions of the slanders that were thrown against the Honourable Captain Ludd and the glorious Luddites centuries ago. Given so many betrayals and defamations, it is thus unsurprising that many engaged in emancipatory politics today may feel that the word progress can leave only a bad taste in one's mouth. For Gramsci and his generation of internationalist revolutionaries at the high tide of popular struggles in the early 20th century, however, the problem of historical progress was posed in very different terms, and terms which I think can help to refresh our perspectives today. Back then, historical progress was not understood in terms of the teleological guarantees of an abstract philosophy of history, but as the very stakes of their struggles contesting the imminent limits of bourgeois political modernity. Rather than simply given by the flow of some homogeneous time, progress for this perspective was something that had to be produced through the resolution of the actually existing contradictions of political modernity. The contradictions between the egalitarian rhetoric of the bourgeois revolution and its substantial continuity with the hierarchies of the feudal order. The contradiction between the declaration of political liberty and the reality of enduring relations of disenfranchisement, in slavery just as much in those forms of wage slavery that continue to be dominant today. Historical progress was thus here fundamentally understood not as a linear accumulation directed towards a predetermined goal, as if we knew from the outset where we were going, but in a comparative perspective as a learning process and as a process of problem solving. To understand hegemonic politics as the production of historical progress is thus to conceive it as a type of immanent critique. It begins from existing contradictions in order to valorize the critical acts and practices capable of resolving them in an enabling fashion. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, This critique was focused on the claims of classical liberalism and its belated adoption of democratic legitimation. We should never forget how long it took the European bourgeoisie to become democratic, at least certainly in many parts of Europe after the Second World War, and in certain areas of Europe all the way through into the 70s and 80s, if indeed they have become at all democratic today. If popular sovereignty was affirmed in theory but not in practice, the type of hegemonic politics in which Gramsci and his comrades were engaged aimed to build the expansive institutions in which meaningful popular participation in political deliberation and determination could occur. If slavery had been abolished on the basis of an inalienable claim to personal liberty, hegemonic politics aimed to extend that claim to the regulation of the supposedly normal labour relations still entrapped within the servitude of private property of the means of production of social wealth. In each of these instances, hegemonic politics aimed to force bourgeois society to progress beyond itself in an imminent sublation of its own constitutive limits. This conception of historical progress is not a normative one, or at least not in the sense in which normativity is commonly understood today. Normativity, for instance, in much contemporary political philosophy, I'm thinking here of currents influenced by John Rawls, is most often invoked in the aestheticized sense of the realization of a type of model or a formalization of the ought as moral prescription. Rather than recommending how things ought to be, a conception of historical progress is, I think, better understood in terms of the Machiavellian tradition of the concrete fantasy in which Gramsci's thought was formed. For Machiavelli, the realistic reformulation of a supposedly moral imperative involved recognizing that the desire for transformation that had been expressed in moral and usually legalistic appeals was not in itself an abstract utopia, but was instead an already operative element in any given situation, one that needed to be valorized and developed on its own concrete terms, dispensing with reference to any supposedly ultimately justifying instance. So too for Gramsci, progress was not an ideal towards which to aim, but in the terms he inherited from Giambattista Vico, it was a concrete making whose efficacy was to be verified in comparative terms. Rather than a determining ideal at the end of a process, this conception of historical progress is thus better comprehended as a categorical perspective from which to begin, from which consequences can be drawn and on the basis of which responsibilities can be assumed. In the political culture of international communism in the early 20th century, the conception that the popular classes could engage in purposive, independent political action was a heresy of what Gramsci sardonically characterized as a religion of liberty, or of 19th century liberalism's betrayed promises. Even when negated by fascist counter-revolution and Stalinist corruption, this notion of the transformation of the unfinished emancipatory tasks of the bourgeois revolution into practices of self-emancipation of the popular classes remained an orienting perspective that defined the continuity of the revolutionary tradition at the moment of its deepest defeats. Today, to argue that the nature of emancipatory politics consists in the production of historical progress is equally heretical. It represents an explicit refusal of the ruling order's declaration of the impossibility of any alternatives to its daily production of historical regress. Attempts to propose solutions to the concrete problems that prevent an improvement in the life conditions of the subaltern classes and social groups does not need to rely upon any philosophy of history or normative guarantee. It is the acts of resistance of contemporary movements themselves, movements against the atomization by legal mandate of institutions of collective popular deliberation, such as trade unions, movements against the divisions promoted by mobilizations around ideologies of racism and sexism, movements against the originary accumulation undertaken by the renewed commodification in the private and public spheres alike, movements against the threat of extinction posed by state-sanctioned and promoted environmental destruction. It is all of these movements that demonstrate in their actuality the possibility that the future could indeed be different from the present. Indeed, it could be unashamedly better than the present if the dynamics condensed in those acts and movements were to find some way of being generalized as a new beginning for society as large. To advocate for the necessity of historical progress today, it is thus not to fall into any easy ideology of a fatalistic progressivism. It is rather to understand contemporary oppositional movements as the actually existing alternatives to the current order. In terms then of the third element of this exploration, the notion of leadership. While the post-New Left explosion of references to hegemony internationally from the 1960s onwards have most frequently understood it in terms of paradigms of domination or sovereign power, the Bolshevik tradition that directly inspired Gramsci's understanding of hegemony's strategic significance most often conceived it as synonymous with social, cultural, and political leadership, which in Gramsci's Italian translation becomes direzione. Even when this affiliation has been noted, the overwhelming influence of the notion of hegemony as a system of power has still tended to understand leadership in this context in terms of a conventional conception of supremacy or command or authority. In short, the notion that leadership is a concentration of power in a hierarchical relationship that consigns mere followers to a lesser and derivative condition. Such an understanding of leadership is ultimately compatible with a very Weberian notion of charismatic power as self-foundational, with all its decisionistic consequences, and is an entirely conventional conception of the functioning of modern political power. Leadership in the Bolshevik debates, however, the debates that inspired Gramsci, particularly those he encountered during his stay in Moscow in the early 1920s, focused not in the first instance on the achievement of power as a capacity to issue commands. Leadership for the Bolsheviks was not something that could be won once and for all. It was instead primarily a strategic response to the necessarily temporally disjointed process of mobilization of the subaltern classes and social groups. The notion of a struggle for hegemony in Lenin's writings, for instance, does not signify a bid for any type of power, whether political or governmental. This is a process that Lenin discusses with a very different vocabulary, looking at notions of dual power, insurrection, Caesar of what is known in Russian as the Vlast. Hegemony, however, is used by Lenin in very different contexts. It consists in the active process of mobilizing the supposed followers of a political program and empowering them to become their own leaders. It's thus a mobilization that, in a Machiavellian sense, creates those who will receive and act upon its message in the very act of calling them forth. For this perspective, hegemony, the notion of the hegemony of the proletariat among the popular classes, did not mean the dominance or the power of the industrial working classes over the peasantry, for instance. It instead meant something more like the prestige, to use a term that Gramsci had encountered in his studies, the prestige of the proletariat's political and economic program among the peasantry and other subaltern classes. Hegemony in this sense occurs when the wider popular classes recognize, or as I've suggested, they recognize, they rethink the political program of a leading class or social group as a way for them to rethink what their own true interests really are and the forms in which they can potentially be satisfied. It was precisely this more expansive sense of leadership that characterized the post-revolutionary developments of hegemonic politics in the early 1920s in Soviet Russia. And for this reason, among many others, it makes at least this dimension of hegemony entirely irreducible to any merely mechanical conception of an alliance between a fundamental and a non-fundamental class, such as was once suggested by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. In Gramsci's pre-prison and also in his prison writings, this relational understanding of hegemony is accentuated and elevated to the level of a conscious political method. Precisely insofar as hegemonic leadership is a capacity to mobilize and activate and inspire followers, it is not a self-referential source of power, but depends upon those following it to maintain its hegemonic status. In other words, hegemony always involves a risk. Rather than the type of sovereign command that seeks to guarantee its own decision, this is an image in which we can see the risk of a proposal that is made to an assembly or a meeting and is trying to find consent. It's a fragile position. It's a tentative foray that hopes for reinforcement. It's experimentation, trying things out. And above all, it emphasizes the productive difference between leaders, or those who would aspire to be leaders, and those they hope to inspire to follow them. This type of hegemonic leadership does not command or tell people what to do, and nor does it merely seek to persuade, to drag people along silently. It instead aims actively to empower and to engage. Herein lies Gramsci's reformulation of what he characterizes, again following Machiavelli, and in polemic against the elitist theorists at the time, as the primordial fact of politics. There really are the governed and the governors, the leaders and the led. Machiavelli had proposed this, the elitists in the early 20th centuries had followed. Gramsci freely admits this. But he says that this recognition is only the beginning of the real problem. The real question then becomes how this given condition in almost any societal context is to be comprehended not as an obstacle to self-emancipatory politics, but as a productive resource for its development. Everything depends, Gramsci insists, on whether this distinction is regarded as permanent and inevitable or as the expression of the possibility of historical movement. The relationship between leaders and followers is thereby reformulated not as given and not as a qualitative difference of type. Rather, it is much more similar to the constitutive temporal difference between an avant-garde or a vanguard and those it seeks to inspire to travel along the path it is highlighted as a viable mode of development. Between the moment of proposal and putting it to work, operationalizing it, or between the political formulation and its sedimentation in social movements as it becomes part of our common sense, there always exists a productive tension, and it is this tension that drives genuinely self-emancipatory politics forward in an exploratory and experimental mode. This conception of leadership is thus not the static relation of hierarchical command. It is instead the exposed and fragile relationality of the experimental hypothesis. This is what science does. As a hypothesis, its truth can never be presupposed, but is always constitutively at risk in the experimental process of discovery, of being negated. Hegemony, instead of the self-assurance proper to modern sovereign power, actively works to remind itself of the possibility of its own failure. In all those moments when a leadership proposal no longer works, when the followers refuse to continue to travel along the path indicated by their former leaders and instead propose an alternative project, in effect, themselves assuming a potentially hegemonic role. To engage in hegemonic politics is to accept the possibility of just such a successful failure at every moment. The failure to produce the productive tension between the political initiative and its social base, or the movement to which it seeks to relate, but also the type of failure that results precisely from the fine-tuning of this tension and its reversal of polarities. In other words, the failure that results from the success of hegemonic politics as former followers themselves become leaders in new sequences and processes of struggle. Hegemonic politics, in this sense, aims to put itself out of business by enabling those who were led yesterday to become their own leaders today. The understanding of hegemonic leadership as risk, as fragility, and as dynamic differentiation represents a distinct understanding of the nature of the empowerment represented by and in emancipatory movements. Above all, it signals the autonomous nature of hegemonic politics from the normal forms of political power comprehended within the paradigm of modern sovereignty, even and especially in their left-wing variants. The Bolshevik and later Gramscian development of this perspective signified a new understanding of the nature of political leadership, not as a mechanism of domination, but as a learning process and as an ethico-political relation of self-emancipation. To imagine leadership in these terms today is to rediscover the essentially strategic dimensions of hegemony as a method of political work, as a way of doing politics. In a time when the mere mention of leadership is still regarded by some with suspicion, or, on the other hand, is all too easily asserted by others in entirely fetishized and ultimately sovereigntist forms, this understanding of hegemony reminds us that leadership is both normal and inevitable. An intervention into the life of a political movement, any intervention, a proposal that the movement adopts this or that priority, or a proposal for the short or long-term value of this or that particular action. All these interventions are always instances of leadership, however brief or modest they may be. What is decisive is not the temporal endurance or even the nominal authorship of any such intervention as a form of leadership, but is instead its openness to experimentation and the risks that are always implicit in its nature as a proposal seeking to mobilize. It is precisely such risks that the plurality of contemporary movements that we've witnessed over the last 30 and particularly the last 10 years continue to encounter as they intersect with their many different values and experiences with each other in the rhythms of all of the different and recurrent mobilizations that continue to define our times on the national just as much as the international level. Finally, then, the fourth perspective, the notion of a pedagogical laboratory. If the strategic perspective of hegemony aims towards the development of a new process of ordering and not merely the rearrangement of an existing order, and if the nature of hegemonic politics consists in the production of historical progress as the concrete and imminent critique of the current state of affairs, and if leadership as an intervention is a method for undertaking such a dynamic and unashamedly partisan project, hegemonic politics nevertheless still confronts a potentially disabling paradox. By taking its distance from the reigning sovereign form of politics, does a hegemonic approach to politics not run the risk of simply falling behind them? Might hegemony, that is, not come to represent anything more than an ephemeral moment prior to the affirmation of one form of sovereignty or another, destined to be replaced by its antagonist precisely insofar as it seeks to make its own dynamic nature endure. Is hegemonic politics, that is, incapable of any form of durable institutionalization without losing the distinctive features that make it what it is? This was the paradox that Gramsci himself confronted while in prison. Alone. He was alone in many senses, not merely in the sense of physical separation from his comrades and family, but also in an ideological sense, alone, separated from the sectarian isolation into which so many of his fellow leaders of the international communist movement fell in the early 1930s. The prison notebooks are in part, and perhaps in large part, an extended attempt to find the strategic perspectives and forms that will be able to make of hegemonic politics a realistic and viable alternative to the sectarianism of the grotesque revolutionary purity of the counter-revolutionary Stalinist Third Period and its aftermaths. Present from the outset of his writings in prison, as their guiding horizon or strategic goal, Gramsci intensified this dimension of his project, particularly in 1932, when he comes to formulate the very Machiavellian notion of the modern prince. And he links this up concretely with his long-standing call for the Italian anti-fascist movement to understand its potential as a form of constituent struggle. The result was a distinctive conception of political organization, not as an administrative apparatus of order, not as a sort of machine that condenses force, and not as a type of monopoly of command, but instead as a pedagogical laboratory, as I'm calling it, of self-emancipatory politics. In other words, Gramsci is attempting to think the possibility of a type of political party that is not simply a small form of the modern state, but instead represents an alternative to it. Gramsci's notion of the modern prince can be regarded as the concrete mythological expression of such a conception. The modern prince is a pedagogical laboratory in the sense that its dynamic of combination and communication aims to create the conditions for a learning process of the already existing potentials for self-emancipation among the subaltern classes and social groups. The modern prince as a mythological and inspirational figure, and its institutional concretization in the dynamic of a constituent assembly of anti-fascist forces, provided forms in which Gramsci thought the subaltern classes could discover collaboratively their own capacities for self-emancipation and self-governance. Its function was to make endure and make productive the differences, tensions, and conflicts that are constitutive of hegemonic politics as an always risky intervention into the historical process. As an expansive process of moral and intellectual reform, it was situated simultaneously in the midst of, outside, and beyond the relations of subalternization that are inherent to the modern bourgeois integral state. The modern prince, that is, was a form of relation and potentially a space in which the subaltern social groups could attempt to reforge themselves into autonomous political forces. The reformulation of political organization, not in terms of powers of command, but in the pedagogical term of a laboratory of self-emancipation, was for Gramsci linked to the needs of the anti-fascist struggle in the 1930s, as what he saw as the most viable form in which the subaltern classes could rediscover their potential for social and political autonomy. It was an attempt then, in the 1930s, to provide an institutional vehicle and form to imagine the unprecedented concentration of hegemony that Gramsci saw as the concrete an actual form of revolutionary practice in those very difficult conditions. Neglected in Gramsci's own time, its spirit soon deformed in the Italian Communist Party's capitulation to the post-war constitutional process and the resulting capitalist republican order. The modern prince has long remained a tantalizing but still abstract utopian figure. To think of self-emancipatory politics today as a type of pedagogical laboratory is, I think, to rediscover the outlines of a language that can help us to describe the dynamic of learning and cross-fertilization that has already been going on for many years in so many of what I think we should refer to as our contemporary intersectional socio-political movements. We see moments in which anti-racist protests, feminist struggles, ecological movements, and revived trade union struggles, each in their own way, confront the consequences and causes of state-inflicted or endorsed violence and attempt to work against them, learning from each other's successes and, even more importantly, failures in the process. The pedagogical laboratory of hegemonic politics, in this sense, represents an attempt to develop the dynamic institutional forms in which the subaltern classes and social groups, precisely in their diversity and even in their divisions, can collectively unlearn all of those habits of subalternity that we have all absorbed, discovering new forms of conviviality, mutuality, and collective self-determination in the process of struggle itself. The organization of hegemonic politics, by providing an institutional context in which the fragility and risk of learning processes can be valorized, represents a concrete way for subaltern social groups and classes to rehearse the conditions of their own, of our own, self-emancipation. Finally, then, to conclude, when conceived as an articulated theory of the structure of self-emancipatory politics, synthesizing a new process of ordering, of historical progress, of pedagogical leadership, and a new practice of political organization, the notion of hegemony can no longer, I think, be reintegrated within the main currents of modern political thought and its sovereign obsessions. Hegemony is not, in other words, just another theory of political modernity or the nature of political, social, and cultural power in general. Hegemony, in this sense, is not a state or a condition to be achieved definitively or provisionally, but instead represents an entirely new way of doing politics, a strategic method of political work that aims to overcome the defining contradictions of political modernity itself and to lay the foundation for the new orders of the future. Thank you.
Moltíssimes gràcies per haver vingut a Barcelona i per la magnífica intervenció que ens has fet avui.
Thank you very much for coming to Barcelona and the magnificent presentation that you made us today.
I per aquesta I per aquest rebat estem al nostre país estem al final d'una etapa.
Ja, no, és que jo crec que per la pregunta igual
És per ell, és perquè ell.
perquè així ja tradueixo la companya.
No, però estem pagant una traductora.
En 20 minuts...
Bé, doncs deia que moltes gràcies per haver vingut a aquest seminari que hem organitzat entre tres entitats que volem entendre el Gramsci, el gramscisme, com una forma de poder pensar en l'emancipació, no com un treball estrictament acadèmic o filosòfic. Al nostre país estem vivint el moment final d'una determinada lectura de Gramsci que durant un temps ha donat un èxit extraordinari políticament, que és la de la clau i muf, però que ara ha arribat al seu final. I llavors la teva proposta d'interpretar l'hegemonia com un mètode, no com un mètode de convèncer, de conquerir més consens, ni com un mètode d'aconseguir provisionalment una arribada al govern, sinó com un estil de treball, com un mètode de treball polític, en fi, jo crec que ens ajudarà bastant, quan puguem pair tota la teva intervenció, doncs ens ajudarà bastant en la fase que s'està obrint. En relació als 4 moments que has plantejat, estretament interrelacionats, jo crec que són una visió que va molt més enllà del que en aquests darrers anys hem estat patint en aquest país en relació a la suposada hegemonia política. Jo em volia referir només a 2 aspectes. Un, el tema del progrés. Vaig descobrir fa un temps que la crítica al progrés, o sigui que la concepció de progrés de Gramsci que ens has explicat està molt relacionada amb una publicació de principis del segle XX de George Sorel, que era una crítica del progrés burgès. És un aspecte que en general no s'ha tocat gaire, ara mateix no tinc el títol en el cap, però era tot un llibre que a més es va publicar traduït a València a una editorial molt coneguda que traduïa les coses més avançades del pensament mundial en el nostre país. Per tant, la idea de que el progrés entès a la forma burgesa tenia el seu punt de partida en la il·lustració burgesa. La il·lustració no és un fenomen únic, hi ha una il·lustració fisiocràtica, liberal, hi ha una il·lustració democràtica. El que és tota aquesta gent, per Sorel, eren l'exemple que el progrés no era l'objectiu propi per les forces emancipatòries. I crec que llegint Gramsci podem trobar traces d'això. I l'altra qüestió és el tema de la divisió entre dirigents i dirigits. L'apartat tercer que has mencionat sobre el lideratge m'ha recordat molt una part dels quaderns en què Gramsci diu que en la tria dels quadres del nou príncep modern, dels organitzadors, dels dirigents, dels quadres, caldrà sempre tenir en compte no perdre mai de vista la perspectiva de que es tracta de superar la divisió entre dirigents i dirigits. O sigui que tard o d'hora l'objectiu que es proposa al príncep modern és l'abolició de les classes i l'abolició de la dominació i de la divisió entre governants i governats, entre dirigents i dirigits. Em sembla que, en fi, que el tercer apartat teu anava en aquesta perspectiva i m'ha semblat de major interès. I per això la perspectiva de pensar l'hegemonia com també des del punt de vista de la pedagogia. És a dir, no es tracta de dirigir, no es tracta d'ensenyar des de dalt, des de fora de la classe. Hi ha un moment en els escrits previs a la presó que Gramsci, crec que és en l'article Democràcia Obrera o en l'article Partit i Revolució de l'any 19 o 20, que planteja que el partit forma part de la classe, no s'adreça a la classe des de fora, sinó que participa des de dins de la classe en el procés. I per tant que la pedagogia ha de permetre no consolidar la divisió de dirigents i dirigits, sinó treballar precisament per això, perquè les classes subalternes arribin a descobrir les pròpies potencialitats que tenen per poder construir un món diferent. En fi, són així, com que ningú s'apuntava, és el primer que se m'ha acudit. I moltes gràcies de nou.
A mi m'ha agradat la teva exposició perquè jo sóc un activista de peu i el que he sentit jo crec que ens pot ajudar a coordinar les diferents lluites d'una població. Diguem, diferents grups polítics petitets. Les lluites sempre tenen a vegades un punt no d'egoisme, sinó de protagonisme, no? I jo crec que aquesta eina, jo sempre he cregut en la pedagogia, jo crec que un polític, si no és pedagògic, no serveix per res. Les lluites hem tingut de ser molt pedagògiques perquè la gent ho entengui, les lluites. I bé, el que has explicat jo penso que és bastant útil per crear, per créixer, menys de ser moviments petits, poder treballar com unes plataformes més àmplies. Jo crec que pot servir per això, que jo crec que ens hem de prendre molt en sèrio tot el que has explicat, perquè pot servir per ampliar la lluita. La gent, primer perquè les lluites vagin més juntes i després perquè la gent se senti protagonista, la gent de peu, que no dirigeixen les lluites, que venen un dia amb elles, se sentin més protagonistes, no? Només una petita reflexió.
Moltes gràcies per la intervenció. Jo només voldria fer dues preguntes. M'ha semblat entendre que has parlat de que posteriorment amb la Fundació de la Primera República aquesta concepció de l'hegemonia del príncep modern passa a entendre's a dins del Pitxí des d'una concepció utòpica i m'agradaria que si poguessis desenvolupar una mica a què et refereixes a això i a com creus que aquesta herència gramsciana i quina lectura es fa de Gramsci posteriorment a la Fundació de la Primera República o inclús també com les crítiques a dins del Pitxí o de part dels operaistes, de Tronti, etc., a certa concepció del pensament de Gramsci durant els anys 60 es poden entendre en base a aquests debats també.
Thank you very much for the comments and questions. Start with, I'm sorry, a comrade here at the front, whose name? Duan. Very, very interesting reflections, and now in a way I maybe will say things that may offend some people. Your reflections upon the experience of Podemos in this country and the cycle of struggles and political organization that emerged over the last decade were very interesting, and particularly when you talked about that as a concrete reading of Gramsci of a certain type. Because it was a reading very much inspired by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe in different ways, and produced a distinctive conception of politics that seemed to work very effectively for a certain period of time, and then ran up against its own limits, in a sense. And the limits they seemed to produce, to me, in Podemos, consisted in this encompassing, homogenizing figure of the people as the core terrain of their operations, without any expansiveness or openness to considering the possibility, as it were, of struggles within the people and the necessary dislocations that occur in any political process, and the various congresses and the fights between the areas and the lack of political momentum that emerged from that, I think can be traced back to theoretical foundations in that particular tradition of readings of Gramsci, Laclau and Mouffe, but before Laclau and Mouffe, a long tradition of reflection in the Italian discussion as well regarding the nature of a hegemonic form of politics. It's interesting to say that experience has come to an end, because I think that's not only in Spain. I think that season, that way of understanding hegemony has now, in effect, been exhausted. It will continue to be there. It will continue to be an important theoretical structure for academic studies and discussions. But politically, I think any propulsive force that it had is now much less. And it may be that new seasons of reflection on Gramsci, asking how we can translate some of his ideas into contemporary struggles, is starting to open up for us as a result of that process. Picking up on a point came through also in a contribution from the back regarding pedagogy. Here I think is one of the central things to try and understand what it is we do when we're doing politics. I think we're trying to win things. We're trying to oppose things. We're trying to win certain struggles. We have certain goals. We set criteria by means of which we can assess whether a movement's been successful, partially successful, or has failed, or so forth. But I think we're also trying to learn something. I mean, we engage in politics because we want to know, can things be different? Can I contribute to changing something in the world to make it better? That is a learning process that's central to how we understand politics. I know for me personally, engaging in politics means that I want to know more. I want to experiment and try. What's interesting is all the structures and the experiences of power relations in capitalist societies give us a strong incentive to forget that fundamental motivation we have in the political field, and learning processes can very easily be cut off, and politics bogs down into wars of position between different groups or different sectarian attitudes. I think trying to emphasize the capacity for us to learn something through concrete political activity is an important perspective to hold on to understand politics as a pedagogical experience. And that means, to use some terms that were very important for Gramsci, which he took from his translation of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, it means always remembering that someone has to educate the educator. That's what's going to happen to you when you're in politics. You're going to learn things, and you're going to be taught things as well. And sometimes you might be able to help others learn some things, but much of the time we need to approach politics with a certain type of humility, because we'll always be surprised by what people, all sorts of different people in different ways, can achieve when they engage in working together to overcome one or another form of injustice. On the topic of the first Italian Republic and the role of the Italian Communist Party in it, I think it's very important to state this fact, which some people have regarded as scandalous when I've pronounced it in the past. I think the most successful political activist of the 20th century was a man called Palmiro Togliatti. That doesn't mean I agree with him on many points. It means I recognize an incredible and astounding achievement in his political work. The Italian Communist Party that developed under his leadership in the post-war period, it wasn't just another political party like other political parties. It was almost a whole alternative society existing inside Italian society, but with massive levels of international prestige and reverberation. And I think it's, without us having lived through that experience ourselves, to understand the depths of that political experience is very difficult today. Now, having said that, after I say my words of praise for Togliatti as a politician, here I emphasize the differences. So much of his achievement was based upon what I see as deep compromises that occurred in the Italian Communist Party's participation in the foundation of the so-called First Italian Republic. And centrally involved in that was also, as a sort of theoretical operation alongside that, the particular way in which Togliatti mobilized Gramsci's thought and sought sources of inspiration and offered certain interpretations of it. This is not to claim that he falsified anything or that he lost some of Gramsci's notebooks, as was a curious debate that occurred some years ago. But it is to suggest that there were real tensions there, and that in many respects the type of politics pursued by the Italian Communist Party later on in the 40s and 50s was very different from the concrete conditions of political struggle that Gramsci had been confronting in the 1920s and early 1930s. Nevertheless, history throws up lots of contradictions, and all sorts of other dimensions come out of that process. It was the fact of such an incredible mobilization of aspects of Gramsci's legacy in the early years of the Italian Republic that led to the growth not only of the Italian Communist Party as a political organization, but a whole galaxy of left-wing cultures across Italy, where many of the themes we are debating today, many of the topics of discussion in radical politics were first significantly explored. You can think of all the various aspects of syndicalist struggle, of so-called first workerism, of autonomous movements, of all intersecting movements of different types. In those years, as Michael Hart and Paolo Vino said some years ago, Italy was a type of laboratory of forms of radical political experimentation. And it's not an accident that today, internationally, there are many vibrant discussions and debates about those theoretical and practical traditions and attempts to translate them into different contexts. To come around to your earlier point, particularly regarding the notion of the modern prince, I would suggest that we can start to understand that term in forms that are much more complicated than we have suspected before. There's an untapped and unexhausted richness in Gramsci's reflection on the notion of the modern prince that, to my mind, seems a particularly promising way for us to understand the processes of moral and intellectual reform that are occurring in many different articulated radical political movements today.
Si voleu fer alguna pregunta més, farem una segona ronda i si no ja acabaríem. Moltes gràcies a tothom per la sessió, la deixaríem d'aquí. Thank you very much for the talk here. I ja està.